Welcome to this special conversation. We are on the sidelines of the Africa Climate Summit. The first time it's taking place in this continent, a lot being discussed, so many deals being signed as far as green financing is concerned, and we are privileged to have the Deputy Managing Director from the International Monetary Fund, that's Mr. Bo Lee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Just begin by telling us, why are you in Nairobi and why is this summit in particular significant to the International Monetary Fund?
Well, I'm here, first of all, because climate has become a significant, very significant part of our work in terms of our annual surveillance, in terms of our capacity development, and also in terms of our lending. So we have incorporated climate in the last 10 years. We have integrated climate into every aspect of our work. I think I'm here also because Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, is particularly vulnerable to climate change, and it is a focal point of our work. And finally, this summit, Africa Climate Summit, we think it's a very good step forward in this critical juncture in terms of fostering collaboration, in terms of promote dialogue, and also in terms of finding concrete solutions, tangible results to, for international community to work together to help Africa to tackle climate change.
All right. Speaking about the role that financing will play as far as mitigating climate-related shocks are concerned, what's your assessment of the financing gap that the continent has, and what role does the IMF play in that?
Well, there are different estimates on financing gap. There are, it range, between $1 trillion to $3 trillion a year. Well, there is a latest report by an expert group showing that among developing countries, including Africa, of course Africa will be a big part of it, there is a gap of $3 trillion a year. And that includes climate, but also include Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So in that particular aspect, IMF is hoping to help as well. Of course, what we can directly lend is very limited, but we are hoping that our lending and our other work can help build an environment that can crowd in more investors, including both public sector and private sector investors.
All right. And speaking about the role of IMF, the Resilience and Sustainability Facility has really gained momentum in the recent past as a topical issue. Kenya has just secured a program recently under that. Let's start from here. What's the RSF, and what role do you see it playing when it comes to climate financing?
Well, RSF is a shorthand for Resilience and Sustainability Facility. It's a long-term lending instrument created by the IMF last year, and it's actually the first long-term instrument from IMF. And it was designed to support our member countries, especially emerging market and developing countries, and also middle-income countries, vulnerable middle-income countries, to tackle long-term challenges such as climate change. And the facility was launched at the end of last year. And in the last 6 months, our board has approved 10 countries to receive funding, including 5 from Africa, by the way. And so far we have seen some good progress in terms of catalyzing reforms and also catalyzing additional financing. The way we see that if we want to scale up investment in climate change, we need a package of policy reforms, capacity building, and also financing instruments. And we are working on all 3 of them with our partners, of course, other MDBs, IFIs, bilateral donors, national governments, and also private sector. And we think we have to work together, both public sector and private sector, if we want to scale up.
All right. One of the issues raised regarding the resilience and sustainability financing is that it must be predicated by an existing program with the IMF. And skeptics have said, look, you're already locking out some of the countries which might need a lot of climate financing intervention as far as this is concerned. Do you see that as a handicap in the architecture of the RSF?
No, actually I think it's a complement, not a handicap, because as you properly pointed out, we require a traditional program with IMF at the same time of RSF program. Because we really see these two programs, they are consistent in terms of their goals. Both goals, their goals are, for the traditional program, we try to build macroeconomic stability and macro financial stability into the country. And the RSF program, of course, the goal is to build climate resilience. Within climate resilience and macroeconomic and financial stability, they go hand in hand because you cannot have one without the other. And in terms of the reforms, they are also complementary because with a stable macroeconomic and financial environment, we can really help the country to attract climate investments. Because investors won't invest in a country that are in crisis, that country are in unsustainable debt, for example, right? So this stable macroeconomic and financial environment we really see go hand in hand with climate investment and climate resilience. Okay.
And allow me to push that envelope a little further. So the cross-conditionalities, especially for we who come from frontier markets, in an environment where we're looking at elevated debt pressures, the concern has been raised that having conditions attached to the RSF as well as the existing program might be a little burdensome for these economies. How do you respond to that?
Well, I wouldn't call it burdensome. I would say that I think both the traditional program and the RSF program are designed to help the country to achieve debt sustainability. And the way to do that, we see there are, we need several layers of efforts. One, we need to have domestic resource mobilization so that there is enough tax revenue, but also there is enough private sector investment because government alone cannot support sustainable growth. So we need domestic resource mobilization, but at the same time we need the international community to support these vulnerable countries, those distressed countries. And we need more grants. We need more concessional financing. And also for some countries, when their debt are no longer sustainable, we need debt restructuring. So all this, we need international partners, international creditors to work together to support these countries. And finally, we also need a global financial safety net to support those vulnerable countries. And at the center of that global financial safety net is IMF. And since the start of the pandemic 3 years ago, we have lent more than $300 billion to more than 96 countries, including 57 countries, low-income countries. So we have provided a very much needed support in time of crisis. And that's why we call on our members to support the increase of quota-based resources for IMF.
Okay. In COP27, which took place last year, one of the landmark developments was the loss and damage fund, the progress made around that. I'm just curious, what role does the IMF see itself playing as far as this is concerned?
Well, first of all, we understand the sentiments and the justification for such a fund, loss and damage fund. And second, we are also an observer to the process. Right now there is a process of negotiation, and we are observers, so we are, we participate in the discussion. And we're also happy to provide advice from a macroeconomic and macro financial perspective in terms of how the fund can be established and how the fund can be utilized.
Kenya is currently has been granted access to the RSF, and I think, to the best of my reading of the latest report, the first access should be sometime in November. Could you maybe just give us some context around the conditions attached to this and how Kenya will be able to access the financing?
Well, like every other RSF country, we have conditionality for RSF program, just like our traditional program. So my understanding is that sometime this year, our team will come in to do the first review. And during that review process, we will discuss with the authorities on the progress on some of the reforms that are committed by the government, by the authorities. And if the review is satisfactory, the country, the authority can access the first batch of financing. So that's typical of all the programs we have, both traditional program and the RSF program. Of course, for RSF program, the conditionality is more related to climate in terms of reforms, in terms of fiscal, in terms of financial. We will, those reforms that are committed by the government, they have to deliver. And, we have confidence that Kenya, like other countries, with the support of the international community, can deliver on those, under those commitments.
All right. Let's wrap up this conversation. When we talk about the climate challenges existing vis-a-vis debt constraints, and many African countries at this point are asking, how do we find a good path towards a fiscal sustainability as far as these two challenges are concerned? What advice are you giving?
Well, I would say that, as I already mentioned, three aspects are important. One, the first one is domestic resource mobilization, because among the gap, either you can say it's 2 trillion or 3 trillion, a majority of that part has to come from domestic resource. Of course, when we say domestic resource, we do not only mean public finance, but also private finance. We need both public sector and private sector to work together to come up with domestic resource. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is, of course, is international support. So I would encourage African countries to work with the international community to, of course, access the existing facilities of many MDBs and IFS, including IMF's RSF. But also there are a lot of bilateral donors as well. And the international community will also work together to try to find concrete solutions. Not only public sector will come up with resources, but also will crowd in private sector money. And finally, I would also encourage African countries to work with international community to think about debt sustainability, to think about how to make debt sustainable. If there is unsustainable debt, how to restructuring debt. So all this have to come hand in hand. Together, we can support the African country to deal with climate change, but also to achieve sustainable development.
Okay. Mr. Bo, my final question. Last week, the President signed into law the Climate Change Amendment Bill focusing on carbon markets. Is there any specific support the fund is extending towards Kenya as it pursues the mission of setting up a carbon registry and to be able to unlock the opportunity there? Well,
certainly, carbon market is, in the mix of potential policy options for countries, including for Kenya. We think carbon market could potentially play a constructive role in terms of pricing the carbon pricing. And we think carbon pricing is important of the policy mix to provide the proper incentive for investors, for industries to move towards a low carbon economy. And in that regard, carbon market could become part of the policy mix to price carbon properly so that there is proper incentive for that transition. So we will be happy to discuss with the authorities in that process how to make the carbon market work, and also how to make the carbon market become an important part of this carbon pricing policy that can help the country move towards a low carbon economy.
Mr. Bowley, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.